Welcome to this podcast episode, and the best diet for perimenopause is. This is part 1, and we're looking at the classic diets. As you travel through this path to menopause, one of the key hormonal changes that's occurring is you get this increased androgen to estrogen ratio. And in particular, it's increased androgens to estradiol, the E2 estrogen hormone. And this new balance of hormones that your body is settling into actually favors central fat accumulation. In one study of over 1 million women, roughly half of which were premenopausal and then the other half were postmenopausal, researchers found that the real area of concern was the central fat mass gain because it's a risk factor for cardiovascular disease and mortality. And this is essentially what we need to be screening for as soon as we're in perimenopause and using all the right sort of tests. So not just doing standard blood tests, looking at leptin, cortisol, androgens, estrogens, and of course, our thyroid hormone function. When the two diets were compared for their nutritional value, it was the Mediterranean diet that scored better than ketogenic, particularly in fiber, which I would have to say is more important for healthy hormone balance. Nutritionist Christopher Gardner had an interesting comment about the benefits of keto versus Mediterranean. He said, the lower in carbs you go, the more you're wiping out entire food groups that are considered very nutrient dense and healthy. What is it about this diet that would be so compelling that you would give up some of these central tenets of health and nutrition? Hi, I'm Sulin Sze, and this is the Well Woman podcast. I've worked with countless women and teenage girls over the years as a natural women's health clinician, and I know how hard it can be to get the help you need to overcome hormonal imbalance, infertility, and perimenopausal symptoms. I bring together my expertise in natural medicine and nutrition with insights from experts in the field of women's wellness to help you get the information you need to make a real difference to your health. This truly unique podcast combines the wisdom of the East with the clinical know-how of modern naturopathy, offering a holistic approach to empower and inspire women just like you on the path to optimized health. I'm your trusted guide as you navigate your hormone healing journey, giving you support, accountability, and guidance along the way. Thanks for listening in, and don't forget to follow or subscribe. It's time to nourish you with Well Woman. Welcome to my 3-part episode on the best diet for perimenopause. This has to be the most comprehensive, evidence-based overview of diets and how they serve women best in the perimenopause period. If you like this episode or any of my other episodes, then please support my work and the hours of research that go into each episode of Well Woman by giving me a 5-star rating and following the podcast. Thank you and enjoy. In this first part of And the Best Diet for Perimenopause is, we're looking at 3 popular diets, the Mediterranean diet, keto, and low carb. I'm going to distinguish what's unique and useful about each one in perimenopause, the pros and cons, and of course what the research has to say about their suitability for the transition period to menopause. Menopause is a high-risk stage for weight gain in women, and it's believed to be the result of these low circulating estrogen levels, and that of course results from a steady decline in your ovarian function. However, weight gain also occurs in the perimenopause, the 8 to 12 years before menopause, where arguably estrogen levels could even peak. So it's really not just about estrogen falling, it's actually due to a cascade of hormonal changes involving more than estrogen and progesterone. It involves thyroid, appetite hormones like leptin and ghrelin, adrenal hormones like cortisol and adrenaline. With your thyroid hormones, it's T4 and it's T3 and it's reverse T3. When you hit your 40s, the reality is your internal landscape just got a whole lot more complicated and confused. The consequence of all this is an increase in total body fat and an evolving waist circumference. A 2018 pooled analysis of over 24,000 menopausal women found that nearly 39% of these women were either overweight or obese. This episode is a deep dive into diet for perimenopause, and having read the papers and looked at the pros and cons of a range of popular diets in the West, I'm excited to share what I've found with you all. Also, this is in the hope that you can make the best decision possible about the type of diet that's going to work for you. I'll suggest first that there are a few common reasons why we would want to refine or even change completely our approach to diet and nutrition because we're in perimenopause. And if you can see which one of these or which couple even you resonate with the most, then I'll be able to tell you which diet is probably going to be the best fit for you by the end of the episode. So remember which one of these reasons you resonate with the best. Reason number one is we have a family history of cardiometabolic disease, namely diseases that affect your heart, your cardiovascular system. This could show up in high blood pressure, high cholesterol, or even metabolic conditions like type 2 diabetes, metabolic syndrome. Having a history of polycystic ovarian syndrome is another one. Having a higher waist circumference and elevated cholesterol. These are also risk factors for cardiovascular disease. And after many years in clinic, I can say, honestly, it's not uncommon for a woman in her 40s to come in and get a blood test done and be a little bit surprised that she's got these gradually increasing levels of what we call low-density lipoproteins, LDLs. This is a type of cholesterol that you'll find on your lipid panel or lipid profile. And we get concerned, and that's good because it kicks us into action. Okay, so that's number one, the history of cardiometabolic disease. Number two, we're frustrated and we're losing hope. We want to stop gaining weight, or we want to try and work off the weight that we've already gained because it feels like this weight, or should I more correctly say fat gain, is just creeping up on us. There's an alteration in fat distribution, so we can see that it's a different type of weight gain than what we might have had in the past. Now it's more around the abdomen, maybe the arms, the upper legs, and definitely in the breasts, particularly if your estrogen levels are starting to surge. It's partly why obesity rates, which are currently quite alarming globally, are more prevalent in women than in men. The experience of this midsection visceral fat gain in women in their 40s and 50s is a sign of the transition to menopause. And you'd expect to see it despite normal eating and exercise habits, as is the incidence of metabolic disorders like insulin resistance, dyslipidemia, and metabolic syndrome. So you're looking on your blood test for things that are a little bit out of the ordinary in your glucose results, your fasting glucose levels, your cholesterol profile, and your insulin levels, and maybe the HbA1c. That's the test that we will often use to screen for diabetes. Reason number three, and this is possibly the best reason to change your diet, is that you're just starting to notice that you're getting all these signs of aging. You might be getting more inflammation or inflammaging, as we call it. You might also notice that you get fatigued more easily. You're getting a little bit of brain fog. You feel like you might be starting to forget things that should be easy to remember, forgetting words, forgetting names, forgetting what you did that morning or yesterday. And we're more easily stressed out, more anxious. I just say this as a generalization. I know that it won't be true for all of us, but I think possibly enough of us have had some experience of physiological impact of the perimenopause and the cognitive impact as well. The research tells us that at the very least, we get this accelerated gain in fat mass, and at the same time, we get a loss of lean mass in the lead up during this life stage, for women to menopause. So in this final reason, it's where you are starting to get symptoms that you never had before, and maybe you're getting more anxiety and you're noticing the brain symptoms kicking in, and there's probably going to be a little bit of body shape change going on as well. Whatever your personal perimenopause story is, there's an adverse impact of the hormonal chaos, the uncertainty that really defines perimenopause. And from this, we then resolve to take better care of ourselves, to sleep more, to get a better work-life balance, to eat better, and start doing the type of exercise that really builds our lean muscle. And I have to say that a change in diet is a great way to reframe your health story. I'm assuming that you're familiar already with perimenopause, but for anyone who wants a little bit of a primer, listen to my episode on demystifying perimenopause. So a couple of things that I just want to put out there before we start talking about specific diets are these. When you change your diet, it's not usually a quick process. It takes time to change our eating habits and behaviors, and also to embrace a new approach to nutrition. So give yourself plenty of time to shift into your new and fabulous diet routine, and even give yourself longer than you would expect it to take, like much longer. Give it many months. I think we all can be a bit guilty of impatience, and we want to see changes in our health, and we want to see changes in our body shape really quickly. So you will just want to challenge that impatience and that tendency and remind yourself that it takes about 6 months to a year to truly embrace a new way of eating. And the other thing is that if you do happen to have a background of insulin resistance, leptin resistance, elevated ghrelin, thyropause, adrenal exhaustion, any sort of metabolic imbalance, then I would recommend having a consultation with a naturopath like me to get your herbal support, because it's going to be hard to get things to shift just with food alone. I'm not saying it's impossible, but from experience, it'll be more of a struggle, and it's totally worth getting as much support as you can and getting things to shift more quickly, because in these sorts of conditions, your hormonal landscape is already dysfunctional, and that's a hard place to start from. I love nutritional medicine, but I find herbs just so much more effective when it comes to managing hormone and metabolic imbalances. So definitely keep that in mind. So let's go first to a super popular diet that's known for lowering cardiovascular disease risk. It's high in protein and natural antioxidants. It's promoting a healthy heart and lowering the risk of metabolic disease as well. It's the Mediterranean diet. It originated in an area called the Mediterranean Basin, which is known to historians as being the cradle of society, incorporating civilizations right from the Sumerians. They're the first civilization to document herbal medicine, and the Persians and the Babylonians, so basically the ancient world. And this area was influenced over time by Greek and Roman nutrition as well. So we have the introduction of bread and wine and oils, as well as seafood like salty fish. That's why today we have this concept of the Mediterranean diet being this triad of bread, oil, and wine. But just know that's not the full story. Essentially, it's a Cretan diet of the 1950s and 60s. So it definitely has its background in the Mediterranean basin, but it has evolved over time, as you would hope. It's rich in vegetables, fruit, beans, seeds, nuts, and cereals. It has just a moderate intake of foods like chicken and fish and wine, so it's really not meat dominant. In the 1950s, a physiologist called Ansel Keys, he passed away in 2004, devised this Mediterranean model to describe and document this diet approach. So much of what we understand of it actually comes from his work. His study examined links between diet and coronary heart disease, so you can kind of see his initial perspective on Mediterranean, designing it as a way to improve cardiovascular health. And he looked at the eating patterns of 7 countries, including Greece, Italy, of course, US, Yugoslavia, Finland, the Netherlands, and Japan. He was especially interested in the cardiovascular benefits of the diet as a low animal fat diet and how one could protect against heart disease using this diet. And on the other side of the spectrum, diets high in animal fats were already known to increase the risk of heart disease. Considering that perimenopause, menopause, and postmenopause are all associated with an increased risk of heart disease, it makes sense that this diet could be helpful. Today, the Mediterranean diet emphasizes a whole lot of fiber, which can help your body remove fats, antioxidants, also very high in this diet, and unsaturated fats. And it's about getting this healthy balance between the energy that you're ingesting and the energy that you're expending through physical exercise. So this isn't just about food on its own, it's about food and lifestyle together. Here's an overview of what this diet looks like. It includes lots of plant foods. So we're talking lots of vegetables, lots of legumes like chickpeas, alfalfa, green beans, lentils, and beans. These are all really affordable foods. They're high in protein, they're very nutritious, and you can make a whole range of dishes with them. There's also nuts and fruits, along with whole grain cereals, and extra virgin olive oil would be your primary source of fat. It's got a strong anti-inflammatory and antioxidant theme while providing more unsaturated fats from foods like, say, avocado or nuts and seeds or olives. And these are definitely healthier than the saturated fats. So the saturated fat foods would be things like butter, bacon, biscuits, fatty meats, cheese, which all, by the way, are really hard on your stomach function. So often if we have too much of these foods, like the fatty meats, the cheese, we start putting on weight anyway. And we especially put it on around that midsection. Sometimes our stomachs can get more nauseous. It's just that the fats you're getting from these foods aren't great fats, and your body knows that. And it has all these ways of telling you that. You'll also find that nuts play a huge role in this diet because they're rich in macronutrients. So your macronutrients are protein, carbohydrate, and fat. So nuts give you this really wholesome food source, and they especially have a high proportion of the unsaturated fats and fiber. So remember, the unsaturated fats are going to be valued more, those from the olives and the avocados, the nuts and seeds, than the saturated fats, which you might get from a big plate of bacon or some red meat. A 2022 study on the benefits of nuts for metabolic syndrome in menopausal women looked at high-quality research, meta-analyses, systematic reviews. It was a huge paper, and they found that consuming a healthy amount of nuts as part of the diet actually reduced blood pressure, and it reduced fat accumulation, and also had a beneficial effect on carbohydrates and fat metabolism. But I also want to say nuts are a little bit fatty, so it's also about your quantities. Yes, definitely include them, but don't eat them excessively. The researchers were trying to see if there was any benefit in nuts for this particular life stage for women, where there was high blood glucose levels or central fat accumulation, or maybe these women had high insulin levels or hypertension. So they were really including women with these sorts of conditions. And they didn't just use studies with weight and waist measurement data. Some of the studies were using imaging technologies like CT scans, which gave a really accurate way to measure lean and fat mass in all of the participants. Ever heard the phrase eat the rainbow? Well, that's exactly what Mediterranean is about. So typically in a day, you'd be eating fruits and vegetables of various colors, with the colors each having specific properties. For example, dark green foods might be a great source of vitamin K, and that's so essential for cardiovascular health. The red foods would be great for inflammation. They'll be very rich in carotenoids, lycopene, and vitamin A, as well as astaxanthin. This is another antioxidant plant chemical. And just think along the lines of your tomatoes, your cranberries, your grapes. They're giving you all of these antioxidant chemicals. And the orange foods would also be rich in vitamin A and carotenoids, playing a role in supporting your hormone health and your hormone regulation, also improving your fertility and your ovulation. Then you have the yellow foods, which are so great for digestive function, often very rich in fiber and helping you to maintain a healthy microbiome, helping you to get your gastric motility working really well, and helping with digestive secretions too. So giving us basically everything we need to break down our food properly. Then you've got the purple and the blue foods, which would be rich in flavonoids with their anti-inflammatory and antioxidant chemistry. So think along the lines of grapes and blueberries having procyanidin chemicals, and quercetin, which helps to reduce histamine symptoms. Definitely one of my favorite anti-inflammatories. Also phenolic acids and flavonoids. And these purple and blue foods are also thought to improve cognition, learning, memory, focus, and mood. So there's this real brain chemistry link between the purple and blue foods. And the research supports this color approach to natural foods. There was a 2011 study which showed a 9% lowered risk of stroke for every 25 grams of white fruit and vegetables eaten in a day. And for every 25 grams serve of orange fruits and vegetables, you then get a reduced risk of coronary heart disease. With carrots being quite high on the list, they contributed to a 32% reduced risk of heart disease. So you'd be eating apples, blood oranges, raspberries, cherries, bell peppers, beetroot, red onion, and tomatoes to boost your antioxidant status and support immunity. You would basically enter the grocery store and make a beeline for the fresh food section and pretty much not go anywhere else. You'd be eating carrots, of course, top of the class, that one. And in fact, I remember a few years ago coming across a study that looked at the anti-cancer activity of various plant families, and the carrot family came up top. It's the Apiaceae family, even more so than the broccoli family. So you'd be eating carrots as well, pumpkin, turmeric and oranges, papaya, peaches, see all these orange foods, mandarins, sweet potato, and they'll give your body lots of beta carotene. You'd be getting bioflavonoids, curcuminoids from these foods as well. And they're not only going to give you this sort of anti-inflammatory action, but they'll help to slow down the aging process. And they're also thought to support healthy hormones and boost your fertility naturally. Then you'd be eating corn, yellow bell peppers, lemons, pineapple, and golden delicious apples. So these will all be your yellow foods. They'll give you the bromelain, the rutin, the zeaxanthin, and lutein. If you've got any eye issues in the family, or if you have eye issues yourself, these are really, really good for eye health, particularly the lutein. And they're also really good for your digestive enzymes and your gastric motility, and generally just helping a healthy gut microbiome. Now, then we've got the green foods. These are going to be really rich in chlorophyll, which is often very alkalinizing and so helpful if your body is a little bit acidic. So what you're doing here is you're heading to the avocados, a few limes in the basket, buying some pears, some green beans, thinking about how you could maybe have edamame as an afternoon snack, thinking about how you can use rosemary in your cooking and baking, thinking about cabbage and broccoli and any fresh greens in your salads for lunch. These green foods are truly about giving your body a boost of these chemicals called glucosinolates, as well as folates, and they're really well-known antioxidants. We've also got chlorogenic acid and catechins in these green foods. So the chlorogenic acid and catechins are often marker chemicals that we use in herbal medicine because they're an indication of antioxidant, strength or potency in an extract. And you get catechins from green tea. So this offers you this antioxidant activity in your body, improves your circulation, and is very healthy for your blood vessels. And that in turn then will help the cardiovascular system function. And finally, we have the blue purple foods. So you'd be eating things like blueberries, of course, blackberries, also prunes and raisins. Don't forget you can get purple carrots as well. You'd be basically getting lots of foods with this rich purple color: eggplant, plums, purple kale, giving you a very strong antioxidant activity. And you'll also be getting really important chemicals like flavonoids, resveratrol. I use this one a lot in clinic to slow down the aging process. You'll be getting steel beans, anthocyanidins. I know this is a whole lot of chemical jargon here, but basically you're getting anti-aging and anti-inflammatory and antioxidant chemistry out of these sort of purple foods. They'll also lift your cognition. They'll balance your mood. The benefits of this diet for perimenopause and menopause symptoms has also been trialled in an Australian study. They looked at women aged between 45 and 50 who were all going through a natural menopause. So basically they weren't having HRT or any sort of medication. And this study was done around a decade ago. So they were looking at the differences between this diet, the Mediterranean, and diets that were high in, say, dairy or sugar or processed meats. And overall, of course, the Mediterranean diet came out tops for reducing night sweats, reducing hot flashes, reducing vasomotor symptoms. Not surprisingly, the high sugar, the high fat diets didn't just not reduce those symptoms, they increased those symptoms. So with all of this talk about fruit and whole grains and salad greens and everything, you're probably wondering, is Mediterranean actually a little bit carby? Well, not really. It's more of a low carb option, actually. Like the keto diet, the emphasis is on healthy fats and proteins, but what I love about it is all of the fiber and all of the anti-inflammatory aspects. This is where it moves into the territory of being more healing as a diet. And in terms of our, global diabetes epidemic, it's definitely one of the better diets to be on because it has lots of positive effects on blood glucose levels. According to Stanford Medicine, it's the easier of the two diets that are particularly good for preventing diabetes or managing diabetes, the other diet being the keto diet. They had a randomized study which observed around 40 participants, so yes, it's fairly small in number, And it was over a 3-month period. It was published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition last year. That's 2022. And the study found that the Mediterranean diet was just as effective as the highly carbohydrate restrictive ketogenic diet, which, by the way, is a lot of commitment and a lot of careful planning. And so it was as effective as this diet in controlling blood glucose levels in patients who had diabetes. So it's a fantastic diet choice if if you're one of those women in perimenopause or menopause who've been concerned about having these rising glucose levels on your blood tests, or maybe you've even had a high HbA1c result in a blood test, which is the indicator for diabetes. They looked at the effects of these two diets on blood glucose levels and risk factors for metabolic disease, cardiovascular disease, as well as weight loss. And they looked at general nutritional status too. And they also assessed, because this is very important, how easy it was to maintain these diets. We all know that it's one thing to start a new diet. It's another thing to be able to sustain it for long enough to reap the benefits from it. Both diets actually did very well at controlling the blood glucose levels and assisting with weight loss, which is great news if this is your intention. And after the 12-week period, both diets were able to reduce the triglycerides and weight overall. The ketogenic actually reduced it a little bit more. It reduced weight by an average of 8%. Mediterranean reduced it by an average of 7%, which is still amazing. Both diets were able to improve the levels of your healthier cholesterols, like your high-density lipoproteins, your HDLs. But the ketogenic diet increased the low-density cholesterol. So these are the low-density lipoproteins, and that's not particularly good. Higher LDL levels, we use them as a marker for increased cardiovascular disease risk. So overall, the patients on the Mediterranean diet were eating more fiber. They were getting more nutrients by the end of the study. And basically, even though both diets were very effective with weight, it was seen as the more sustainable of the two. Where the two diets were then compared for their nutritional value, of course, Mediterranean diet scored better. It's not as restrictive as the ketogenic diet. It scored better in terms of the fiber content, which I would say is possibly even more important for healthy hormone balance. Christopher Gardner, who's a nutritionist, he had an interesting comment to say about the differences between keto and Mediterranean, and he had quite a few concerns about these restrictive diets. So he said, the lower in carbs you go, the more you're wiping out entire food groups that are considered very nutrient dense and healthy. And I have to agree with this, especially in perimenopause. Do we really want to be so restrictive that we're not getting the anti-inflammatory and the anti-aging chemistry that we need, or that we're not getting enough energy and fuel for our brains and cognitive processes? And he also said, what is it about this diet, meaning the keto diet, that would be so compelling that you would actually give up some of the central tenets of health and nutrition? Another really good point, I think. So it does beg the question that keto may be more of a weight loss diet at the end of the day. Maybe you're not going to sustain it for a long period of time, but it's definitely not a health diet. Not saying that it isn't healthy for some of us if it fits us really well, but I don't think it's the best choice if you're really health focused and you want to eat good food. And another thing you might be wondering is, well, Mediterranean seems not to recommend too much meat. So with all this talk about getting enough protein, is it really good to have a low meat intake? Well, the benefits of being low in meat would be reduced risk of some of the modern conditions that are associated with a high meat intake. For example, there was a 2006 study on premenopausal women and their risk of breast cancer, comparing the meat eaters to the non-meat eaters. There were over 90,000 women in the study. It was a big study, and it was also conducted over a 12-year period. So we get this really good sort of longitudinal perspective. And they found that a higher red meat intake was strongly related to an increased risk of breast cancer, a little higher for the estrogen receptor positive breast cancers compared to the progesterone receptor positive ones. And overall, the researchers concluded that eating red meat more than 3 times a week could be problematic in terms of increasing breast cancer risk. And by the way, you're not limited to meat for your protein. You can also use protein powders, and you can use protein-rich legumes, nuts, and seeds. Can you use spices in this diet? Absolutely. The Mediterranean diet actually is already infused a very, very long time ago with spices from the Orient. They were originally introduced by the Turkish Empire and the Arabics. So we're talking spices like cinnamon, cardamom, clove, ginger, turmeric, and nutmeg. Really great spices that you can use in a range of savory cooking as well as the sweeter dishes. And these are the sorts of spices that would have been traveling the seas between East and West, moving along the Silk Road at camel speed, and part of a lucrative and complicated history of, this spice trade that was occurring between India, Indonesia, the Middle East, and across the Mediterranean to Europe. So, in fact, if you like spices, this diet is probably going to seem like second nature to you. And I know I've mentioned some of the Eastern spices there, but of course we have the staple, more Mediterranean spices and European spices. So we have basil, coriander, parsley, oregano, paprika. To be honest, in a lot of Mediterranean cookbooks, you'll see a really strong emphasis on using fresh herbs. In other words, these sort of culinary herbs. And we've also got marjoram, fennel, dill, cloves, rosemary, lavender, even garlic, bay leaf in your cooking and stir fries, sage, saffron. Saffron is also really good too for mood. And thyme and tarragon and sumac. Who doesn't like sumac sprinkled over their eggs in the morning? And what makes this diet so healthy for women in perimenopause? Well, when you have this natural combination of these fresh foods, the fruits, the fiber, and the low saturated fats, you get a lower intake of what we call trans fatty acids. And together with the high fiber intake, you get better hormone clearance and better hormone regulation. In the case of perimenopause, where estrogen can skyrocket and then dive, it basically goes into an unhealthy loop of highs and lows. Clearing excess hormones at this time is thought to be, one reason why there are fewer vasomotor symptoms with this diet, because it just has that fiber and it has that ability to help your body to, cleanse internally. It helps the liver function, it helps the bowels and the digestive system. And this diet also has positive effects on blood glucose levels, and that's important because regulating blood glucose levels and avoiding resistance issues with insulin and leptin is one way that you can manage a healthy weight throughout perimenopause and then in the first couple of years of postmenopause. With the Mediterranean diet, there are more low glycemic index foods as well, and this translates to lower glucose spikes after eating, and your glucose levels also start to decline more gradually. So you probably won't get too many cravings and too much fatigue on this diet. One more thing, the effects on inflammation. Perimenopause is a great inflammatory event. It's the time of your life where you'll start to see these random symptoms emerging, food intolerances, itchy eyes, blepharitis, vaginitis, arthritis. Notice the itis at the end of all of those. Medically, this is a reference to an inflammatory state. So this is one diet that is truly geared to reduce inflammation and oxidation in your body. It's rich in the flavonoids, quercetin, the polyphenols, the catechins, that are all chemicals we use in herbal medicine as therapeutic agents for a whole range of inflammatory conditions. And research shows us that this diet can lower inflammatory biomarkers, which are more common in women with vasomotor symptoms like hot flashes, night sweats, and joint pain. Is this the most wholesome diet? I would argue that it possibly could be. You get a lot of minerals and wholesome nutrition from the legumes. The beans and lentils, for example, they have a high protein character. They can be used as meat substitutes. The legumes are rich in fiber, vitamin B, minerals like calcium, potassium. These are all absolutely essential in perimenopause. They're important for bone health. Also, you get a lot of zinc in your legumes, possibly the most important mineral for hormonal regulation. Best thing, though, about legumes is their low glycemic index. And great news if you're having weight gain issues or if you're battling insulin resistance, insatiable cravings and appetite, or that sort of thing. There was a paper published in the journal Frontiers in Endocrinology in 2022, and it revealed that if you eat more legumes, you will have fewer menopausal symptoms, while eating extra virgin olive oil was associated with fewer psychological symptoms. I thought that was really interesting, in that the vasomotor symptoms of perimenopause and menopause are improved by these fiber-rich and protein-rich foods with the Bs and the calcium and the minerals. whereas the psychological symptoms were improved with the good fats. That was really interesting. It looked specifically at women in postmenopause with obesity. So age-wise, it is a little older than your typical perimenopausal woman. The average age in the study was 57, whereas with perimenopause, we would say more likely 38 to 52. But I think it is good just to give us a sense of what sort of ingredients are working well on which types of symptoms. I'd also say that the Mediterranean diet sits on the cusp of being a medicinal diet. It's just such great nutrition, but it also has that antioxidant property, which comes in part from the fruits and the emphasis on fresh foods, but also from the beans and the other legumes, which are really rich in antioxidants like flavonoids, lignans, tannins, phenolic acids. Again, sorry, a lot of chemistry there. Just know that these are all plant chemicals that we study in naturopathy, and they're known to be not only antioxidant, but anti-inflammatory too. So in summary, the Mediterranean diet is going to help you get your blood glucose levels down if they're high. It'll give you a lot of healthy food from all of the food groups, but with more of an emphasis on plant proteins. And it suits a meat eater who's wanting to go a bit more vegetarian, or a vegetarian who might be dealing with low energy, fat gain, just wanting to broaden into a little bit more meat. Going back to the 3 reasons why you would adopt a new diet in perimenopause, this diet, I would say, serves mainly number 1. You're really wanting to get a better cardiometabolic profile, as well as possibly lose some weight. And it's more maintainable when compared to the ketogenic diet for weight loss. It also has the added benefits of improving bone density and vasomotor symptoms, blood glucose levels, mood, symptoms of depression. It may also prevent or reduce the risk of breast cancer. So there is a lot more reasons actually beyond cardiovascular health. And that's according to a 2020 research paper on the Mediterranean diet and its benefits for menopausal health. You do need to commit long-term to this diet to see its benefits though, so plan on adopting this diet pattern over the longer term and know that it's predominantly plant-based. There's also an assumption that you're physically active and maintaining a healthy lifestyle to see benefits with the Mediterranean diet. So the diet on its own isn't enough. If you have a sedentary lifestyle, you may not see the same benefits as those observed in the clinical trials. What you'd be expected to be doing is regular exercise 3 times a week, 30 minutes at a time, as your sort of basic starting point, and also including the type of exercise that lifts your heart rate. Now, let's talk next about the low-carb diet, and then we'll circle back to ketogenic later on. The low-carb diet is otherwise known as the LCD. It's a way of eating that minimizes carbohydrates like grains, legumes, fruits, breads, pastas, starchy vegetables like potatoes, and of course, sweets and lollies and refined sugars. And it's geared towards improving metabolic health. So as you can imagine, it is great in perimenopause, where our metabolic hormones and hormones involved in satiety and appetite, they just don't function as well. Like ghrelin. Ghrelin is the hormone that makes you feel hunger, and leptin, which is the hormone that tells your brain when you're full and you don't need food anymore. As a diet approach, it has been a little controversial, more so because it's tied to the very low carbohydrate ketogenic diet, because the goal of this type of diet is essentially to restrict carbohydrates significantly, which then leads to a lower availability of glucose, that essential nutrient that fuels our energy in our brains, which then leads to changes in the blood levels of insulin and glucagon hormones. And at the end of all of this, your body realizes it now has to become more metabolically flexible by using fat as an energy source. So it gears up for fat oxidation rather than fat storage. Now, doesn't that sound good? Burning off fat instead of storing it. But there is an important distinction to be made with low-carb diets. They do limit your carbs, and they do reduce your caloric intake. But they don't necessarily increase your fat and protein intake, which distinguishes this diet from keto. So a low-carb diet really isn't the same as a high-protein diet and could potentially be quite unhealthy. Both are equally important in perimenopause though, so ideally we can get a blend of both. In the early days of low-carb diets, an average daily intake of 25 to 50 grams of carbs was allowed in a day. So if you think about this in real life, it's like eating a bowl of rice. A bowl of rice would give you 25 to 50 grams of carbs, around about 44, I think. 100 grams of cooked pasta gives you about 25 to 40 grams of carbs. That's the sort of amount of carb that you're allowed, which is quite restrictive. And naturally, you start to wonder, okay, I can do this for a while, but is it sustainable? And then you also wonder, what about the whole grains giving you the vitamins and the minerals and the fiber, and what you're sacrificing by eating such low amounts of carbohydrate? Those figures there are probably sounding a bit extreme, aren't they? Today, the low carb diets had a few revisions and we're now upping the intake. So if you were on a low carb diet today, rather than when it began, you would be looking at somewhere in the vicinity of 50 to 150 grams total in a day for a standard low carb diet. So it's actually still quite low, but it's more doable. If you're on a ketogenic, very low carb diet, you'd be having less than that. I think, it's a bit simplistic, but imagine that you're embarking on a low carb diet and you start by cutting out your refined sugars. You cut out your white sugars, your sweeteners, any cereals or mueslis or sweet breakfast, any pastries, no desserts at all. Maybe that's a better way to go about it. What I've observed in clinic is that a low sugar diet or sugar-free diet does tend to work really well for healthy weight maintenance. And it has a host of other benefits too. There's less bloating, there's improved cognition, there's better vascular health, less headaches, improved eye health. Liver function tests give better results. There's less dental disease, less inflammatory disease, and particularly there are fewer histamine-related allergy symptoms and premenstrual syndrome symptoms. So I think it's a good starting point. If you start one of these diets and it just feels too complicated, just start by going sugar-free or avoiding foods that have refined sugars in them, and then go on from there. If you're a woman with a family history of cardiometabolic disease, diabetes, heart disease, obesity, or anything like that, I think the sugar-free diet would be really, really good. I mean, essentially, what are you restricting from your diet? Sugars that make you feel brain fog, stress your liver, and make you put on weight. So it's not such a bad thing to restrict. For women with a family history of cardiometabolic disease, diabetes, heart disease, obesity, or anything like that, I would recommend looking at just doing it going sugar-free. And basically, you're just restricting the type of refined sugars that make you tired, have cravings, afternoon energy crashes, make you gain weight, give you brain fog, give you headaches, stress your liver. Not such a bad thing to be restricting, really. There was a 9-year plus study done in Dutch women. There were about 15,000 women in the trial. It was published in 2007, and they found that having a high sugar or glycemic load in the diet in women increased their risk of cardiovascular disease. So the low-carb diet would be the sort of diet that would appeal to somebody who was seeing that their markers for cardiovascular disease were increasing. For example, that they were getting hypertensive, that they were seeing cholesterol levels increasing, and they were seeing more inflammation in their bodies. And weight management would also be a key, if not the top driver, for a complete diet overhaul in perimenopause. So if you're fitting into that second category that I mentioned at the beginning, where you're frustrated and you just want to start being able to shift some weight, this diet would be good in that respect. The research tells us that fat mass increases significantly in the years between the premenopause and postmenopause. They're basically saying that fat mass comes with perimenopause, and this impacts the body mass index, making it higher essentially. This means that you're going to end up with poorer cardiometabolic health in the long run. There was a 2019 meta-analysis. They found that increases in fat mass occurred pretty much everywhere except the legs. So total leg fat percentage actually decreased. Might sound good, but it was actually a reflection of the changes in fat distribution that occurs in menopause and maybe some loss of protein. So maybe not so good after all. They found that fat in the trunk area increased, visceral fat, hip circumference, waist to hip ratio, waist circumference, total body fat percentage. It's quite overwhelming actually to see all the studies that are coming out on fat gain in perimenopause. But honestly, it's about time that we started to do more screening for this, and also just to let women know that there are things you can do, such as seeing a naturopath like myself or a nutritionist. So the authors of this 2019 study concluded that we need more careful screening for women. We need to look at the central fat gain because it's linked to an increased risk of cardiovascular mortality. And I really think this should be a key factor to consider with diet if you yourself have this central fat gain. You need to know which diet is going to target that visceral fat more effectively. That's what we really want to know, rather than just what's the best weight loss diet around. Things like that are not going to be as sustainable and maybe not as effective. It's more a case of what's the best diet for reducing adiposity or visceral fat gain, and is it supported by evidence? Another common story that I hear in clinic is I'm not doing anything different, but I keep getting bigger and I really don't want to go up another clothing size. And this study in 2019, it was a big study. It was based on collated data from over 478,000 premenopausal women and even more, 571,000 postmenopausal women. These are a really big study. So it meant that they could observe more objectively the differences in weight between the premenopausal women at the beginning of this journey and the menopausal women at the end. It was great that they chose these samples because the premenopausal women could also be considered a control. Like a control is the part of the study, the participants who you don't really change anything with. You want them to be kind of like your baseline. It meant that you weren't just getting women who were in the middle of their perimenopause journey with already skewed weight results. It meant that you really truly got women before all of these hormonal and metabolic changes were kicking in. And a sample size of over 1 million women, that's a very respectful number of participants. If you're wondering what role hormones have to play in this process, it's definitely related to metabolic hormones like insulin, leptin, and ghrelin, but it's also thought to be due to a higher level of androgens in women compared to estradiol. Estradiol E2 is the most active form of estrogen after menopause. We tend to get, less of the estradiol. And we make our androgens from DHEA hormones, which are very popular for their youth imbibing effects. So I'll often screen for DHEA levels with my patients just to see where things might be going awry in the hormone synthesis pathways. So in summary, the low-carb diet, it isn't as refined or sophisticated as the Mediterranean. It has a stronger focus on weight loss. I think it's going to be much harder to sustain, considering the very low levels of carbohydrates that are allowed in it, not to mention the valuable carb food sources that you're going to end up restricting from your diet. For a quick lowering of blood glucose, it could be a good option. It's just that the studies that have been done so far, they probably haven't been in a long enough duration to give us really valuable feedback on the low carb diet and how it relates to perimenopause. And if I were you and you're thinking low carb does sound exciting, but you're a bit concerned about some of these aspects of it, the restrictions and the sustainability, then maybe start on sugar-free. It's a great entry point to a longer term low carb diet that's not too low, and it has many other benefits apart from weight loss. In a typical keto diet, you're trying to build metabolic flexibility once again and shifting towards this more fat-burning pathway to produce your energy. Typically, about 70% of your caloric requirements are going to be met by fatty acids in this diet. So you're actually favoring foods like meat, butter, avocado, nuts, and seeds. Of course, that's a whole range of fatty foods with different types of fats in it. Glucose, as a simple carbohydrate, will only account for less than 10% of your caloric requirements in the ketogenic diet. It's really low carb. And that's what makes it well suited to reducing weight and improving metabolic disease markers like your blood glucose levels. It's also been shown in studies to reduce C-reactive protein, which is one of your markers for inflammatory disease, when it's in combination with exercise. When you have a diet like this, which includes say 5 to 10% of a carbohydrate intake in the diet, you do see hunger levels decrease. That's what makes the whole process of eating less a lot easier. But I'm talking very low levels of carbs. For example, there was a study done on appetite with low carb diets that involved eating only 20 grams of carbohydrate a day. And this led to a 50% reduction in the serum leptin levels, which is a fantastic result. But then, half a cup of rice is only half a cup of rice. Also, the ketogenic diet has been found in some research to increase a type of cholesterol called LDL. As I mentioned before, the low-density lipoproteins are a risk indicator for cardiovascular disease. It's not a particularly good cholesterol level if you start to see it increasing. It's one of the cholesterols that most of us naturopaths will kind of fixate on a little bit more than others when we're looking at blood markers for metabolic health, for obesity, and for cardiovascular disease. I'm definitely not against keto, though. I've seen good results with keto in clinic. Just be prepared to really commit to it over the longer term. And it's worth mentioning that a lot of the studies on keto, they tend to be quite short in duration. You might find a lot of studies that only go for, a couple of weeks. And really, you need to be on this type of diet for 6 months to a year to actually reap the benefits of it. The study I mentioned previously that was comparing Mediterranean and keto was definitely well-timed. It was a 12-week duration. The results are more reliable from that. And things like the 9% drop in the HbA1c levels for keto patients and a 7% reduction in the HbA1c levels for Mediterranean diet patients, that's a really good outcome. The HbA1c test is a blood test for diabetes, so the higher it is, the more likely that you're diabetic. Of course, it depends on the ranges, so you need to look at the actual test result and go by their clinical ranges. And then also there was this 8% weight loss on the keto diet compared to a 7% weight loss on Mediterranean. So you can see that keto might be a little bit better in terms of performance on weight loss. Both showed improved insulin and glucose levels. Both showed increased good cholesterols, the high-density lipoproteins. And both improved liver enzymes as well. In particular, the ALT. ALT stands for alanine transaminase, and it's one of a couple of really important liver enzymes that we look at when we're assessing liver health. But overall, it's interesting that even though the keto showed better results for weight loss, it was concluded that it is at the expense of removing some very heart-healthy, quality carbohydrate foods. Well, I hope you enjoyed part 1 of And the Best Diet for Perimenopause Is. So don't forget to continue listening. I'm going to be back soon presenting part 2. Very excited to tell you all about something called the protein leverage effect and to talk about high fiber diets and high protein diets. Have a beautiful day. And don't forget, you can always follow this podcast. I love to think that you'll be coming back for more Well Woman. And to support my work, please feel free to leave me a 5-star review. Have a fantastic day and see you soon in another episode of Well Woman.
Hey everybody, please note that the information, opinion and advice provided in this podcast are not intended to replace professional medical care. They are for general information and educational purposes only. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast may not always be those of the host. Thanks for listening.